What's up everyone, it's Goose, and today I wanted to start the series on comparing some of the modelers that I've had. I have a lot of ideas in mind, like we're talking about specific amp models or IR loaders or how each modeler takes an overdrive, like a real overdrive. But today I actually wanted to go over something that I don't feel like gets touched on in too much detail in comparisons, and that's build of these modelers. We'll be going over the Quad Cortex by Neural DSP, the HX Stomp XL by Line 6, and the Fractal FM9. The FM9 in particular is actually quite a bit bigger than the other two. However, with the Quad Cortex, you're kind of playing in this same price point. And if you want to jump down to the price point of like an HX Stomp XL, which I think is like $700, you could argue that the FM3, which is half of this at like about $1,000, is kind of also in the same running. But also this is to really give you a kind of indication of what you're getting at the price point. The HX Stomp is definitely the most affordable sort of big name player in the modeling space. If you want to jump up from the HX Stomp XL to the Quad Cortex or to the FM9, it would be good to know what you're getting also in terms of build improvements. All right, before we move on, if you like this video, if you like the kind of content you're seeing on this channel, please consider hitting like and subscribe. It greatly helps out the channel and is so incredibly appreciated. So let's get into it. Let's get comparing. The first area where we're going to compare is the chassis. Starting off with the FM9 because it's already in my hand. The chassis of this is so incredibly robust. So the biggest differentiator between the FM9 and the other products is that it has rubber sides actually. So while the chassis itself is metal, the sides here are actually made of rubber. The rubber kind of feels like the grip of like a tennis racket or something. The chassis itself, the metal chassis, feels like something almost like, I want to say like truck bed liner, like it's like so rugged. And because this is the biggest unit of the three, this is actually the heaviest one. If we're talking the FM3, I would say probably about half the weight of this, so probably more comparable. But the FM3 is also made of the same materials too. But yeah, the chassis is super crazy cool. The back is also very sturdy, so I'm not feeling like the back is going to like cave in or anything. And overall, just a extremely well-built unit. Also, one of the coolest things about having that rubber siding on the FM9 is that if you need to just put it down somewhere, it literally just stands like this. At the same price point, you could get a Quad Cortex. Now, the build of the Quad Cortex, it's a lot smaller. It's an all-metal build, however, and it's very strong feeling. The top of the chassis and the sides in particular are very sturdy. The metal feels very, very firm. I could never imagine anyone stepping on this and feeling like it's gonna dent or anything, even though it kind of just looks like thin aluminum. It's actually quite sturdy on the top. Also, full disclosure, I bought this used, but it's still in great condition. There are a few marks on the sides because of just use. And what's nice about this material is that it doesn't like take on a lot of kind of fingerprint or like marks. You can't really notice the marks unless you're going to look for them. The one thing about this chassis that I don't like is the back panel. So the back panel here is actually really thin. There's only 4 screws on the back, meaning that there's actually a little bit of movement if I push this area here. Don't know if y'all could see that, but if you see where this panel reaches the end right here, if you push, there's actually a little bit of movement there. And another thing to note, because there's a vent here, I wouldn't cover this. So if you're putting it on a pedal board, make sure not to cover this. And because of how thin the steel is, some of these vents are no longer the same size as the others. Like they're slightly bent in a way. And I guess that's just from putting it onto a pedal board or putting it onto a desk. So this back panel is like the only weak portion of this. Everything else feels super solid. I don't think in regular use you're gonna notice anything. If you're placing this up and down onto desks or onto pedal boards, this back panel might just start to show a little bit more wear and tear. And this is actually a very light unit. I think it actually feels just as light as the HX Stomp, despite being a little bit bigger than it. That's convenient because you can just grab it and go. So other than the back panel, I think the chassis itself is actually really durable. The HX Stomp XL, this is obviously at a very low price point compared to the other two. This back panel feels much more solid than the other two, interestingly enough. The top is made of this kind of glossy sort of sparkle finish here, and it feels super durable. The only thing I would say is that it leaves marks pretty easily. So if the light runs through, you can see like any imperfections in it. But the chassis feels so solid, and you can see how thick the metal is on the sides here. And that is actually very confidence inspiring on this unit. So interestingly enough, despite it's costing less than the Quad Cortex, this is actually built slightly better in my opinion in terms of chassis. In my thoughts, you kind of get what you pay for. The FM9 definitely kind of takes it in terms of overall build, but the HX Stomp is really impressive in terms of just at the price point, how well it's built, even compared to the Quad Cortex. And the Quad Cortex is built well. So that just makes the HX Stomp even more impressive in my opinion. All right, let's get on to the switches. So the FM9 switches are linear. They have no notable click or bump to them, and the tension gets stronger as you push down. I have never accidentally pushed any of these. However, sometimes I have felt like I had to push a little harder than I would like. There is quite a bit of tension, and even after about, I would say almost a year of use at this point, these buttons are still just as firm as they were. And so yeah, the linear feel is nice though. I don't really particularly see a point in having any clicks or bumps, because you're just going to be stepping on it anyway. I very rarely feel like something like a Boss pedal, which is a linear push versus a very clicky pedal like Electro Harmonix pedal. I never ever feel like there's really a difference there when you have shoes on and you're stepping on these. Like it doesn't really, you don't really feel it too much. I always step all the way down with the switch anyway, so linear switches work perfectly fine, but just note that these do have quite a bit of force needed to actually get to the very bottom. And I know the actuation point isn't quite at the bottom, but it still is just something to note. The Quad Cortex switches are actually really interesting. We have to talk about the fact that they are also knobs. But we'll do that in a later bit. I'm just going to be talking about the switches as switches itself here. The switches are interesting because there's a bump. So if anyone knows like keyboards, these are like MX Browns, the tactile style. Like if you press down, there's a notable bump, but it's not like a click. And I actually demoed one of these new, and the switches were a lot firmer than they are here on this used unit. So I would imagine over time, these are actually wearing in a little bit to be a little bit looser. But I've actually had no issue with like using this and switching scenes and switching presets and whatnot with this. I think the force is just right. I think the fractal actually takes a little bit more force to push down. Again, the new unit was a little bit stiffer than this. Considering how much firmer they were when I tried it in person, that would be my only concern about these switches, but so far they've been pretty solid. And then the HX Stomp XL switches, I don't know if these are the same as on like the Helix, but if they were, these are actually some of my favorite switches that you can get. So if you can hear, they're slightly clicky, but the switch itself feels linear and the click seems to be sort of artificial. Like there's just something clicking. It's more of an audible click than a mechanical click. It feels more like a linear switch when you're actually pressing it in practice, but it feels so high quality and there's no like increasing tension like on the fractal. So I never feel like I need to press a little bit harder than I usually do on this. The only caveat I have about this is that the switch doesn't have the hex screw on top here. The other two units do have hex screws on top of it. So I'm presuming if you wanted to repair one of the switches, you could just replace the switches really easily. This seems to be less repairable in that regard. So if I were to go for one of these in terms of switches and the switch feel, I would go with the HX Stomp. I think the switch feel just feels perfect on this. Again, I question whether or not these switches can be repairable easily without that hex screw on top. It could be that when you open it up from the back, it just slides completely out. And in that case, great. But I have not tried to repair these. So just in terms of the feel, I like these the best. However, in terms of the repairability, I'm not quite so sure. But I really do like the fact that the switches also have the light around them. It doesn't have the scribble strips like on the FM9, but I actually prefer this round ring around the switch for color rather than the dot on top of the Quad Cortex. The Quad Cortex, however, does have the screen, the giant screen to tell you what patch is what, so it's kind of a draw there, but if I didn't have that, I would just prefer this. All right, so let's move on to knobs and buttons. And the first one I actually want to go through here is the Quad Cortex because it's very interesting in that regard. So the Quad Cortex, the knobs are actually just the switches themselves. These switches basically have a rotary pot in them. They feel really good to use. They're a little bit scratchy, but I haven't felt like they weren't responsive or anything to the stuff on the screen. I actually initially got worried that if I were to press down on a switch and like swipe my feet a little bit, that I would accidentally rotate it. You actually need quite a bit of force to rotate any of these switches, so that's never been an issue. So yeah, I think the switches as knobs actually ended up working really, really well in the Quad Cortex's favor. But the one knob that I don't like is this. So if you're plugging into your interface, this is the knob that controls the volume, and I don't like it. It feels like it's rubbing against the rubber band as you're like rotating it, the resistance just doesn't feel very accurate. Moreover, weirdly enough, on this unit, and it's hard to show you without it turned on, so I'm going to turn it on. So this knob, if it is at noon, it's actually at 55 for some reason and not at 50. Even though the knob goes all the way to 5 o'clock and 7 o'clock, respectively, for the min maxes, it's just strange that 50 isn't at the very like noon position. And with that weird resistance I was talking about, it's actually really hard to get this like super accurate. You see how it kind of jumps a little bit? This knob is definitely kind of the weakest point of this unit, especially considering that these switches, dials are so like great to use. I actually love using these. This knob is just not doing it for me. So I hope in future modelers that Neural makes, they kind of try to make this knob a little bit better. So the FM9's knobs are actually pretty, I guess, just kind of standard. They're a little bit inconsistent. So the knobs here, for example, are very clicky. And if you go through menus, it'll go through them click by click. But the knobs here for the outs aren't. And that kind of sucks for me because if I want my out 1 to be exactly at noon, because it's so linear, it's sometimes easy to just like push it off, and I kind of don't like that about it either. However, the giant knob for value is the same as the knobs here underneath the screen, and I like these knobs a lot. They're very tactile and very accurate. The actual buttons here on the navigation are very nice, but the buttons are very clicky. They're definitely clickier than something like a video game controller button or something. And I'm sure these will wear down for people who use this interface a lot. I personally use the desktop interface a little bit more, but it's kind of just nice to know that they're as firm as they are. I just don't like the out knobs on this. The other ones seem really, really good. The clicks for these buttons right here feel exactly the same as the clicks here in terms of just the weight needed. So it's nice that they have that consistent. Now the HX Stomp, again, this is a lot cheaper, so we're going to be expecting kind of less quality here in my opinion. One of the things I don't like is that the volume is here. It's nice in theory because you can just set your volume and then push it in so that you don't accidentally mess up the volume going out. However, in my experience, the volume actually doesn't work too well. Sometimes it just doesn't register, so I don't know if that's this unit. But the other knobs on here also are kind of interesting. I like the knobs on the right of the screen because they're the clicky kind again. I kind of just prefer the clicky knobs, kind of like on the Neural Quad Cortex or the FM9. So having only these two be the clicky ones, it kind of feels like I wish that these were also clicky. These right here are not clicky at all. And I think that's kind of an issue because these are where you adjust your settings for your amp or your overdrive or whatnot. And so you can kind of overshoot on accident because it's not clicky. I kind of just prefer click everywhere. The buttons actually feel nice to press down. They're a little firmer than on the Fractal, but not necessarily higher quality. It just feels firmer to press down. And they're a little bit inconsistent. Like this one just takes a lot more force to push down than the other 4 buttons on here. And then there's these buttons on the side of these knobs, which feel okay. They don't feel too bad to use. I don't think that they'll have any problems in the future, but these actually do feel more like a video game button rather than like on the FM9 where they're a little bit more robust than a video game controller. So yeah, interestingly, I don't think any one of these units actually just outright wins. On the Neural, this volume knob is just really shitty. I don't like the out knobs on the FM9, nor do I like the settings knobs on the HX Stomp. So it's kind of a wash. I don't think there's a clear winner here. And the screen on the Quad Cortex is obviously going to be the biggest of all of them. It is a touchscreen as well, so there's additional functionality to this. And actually, the screen doesn't feel like flimsy or anything when you push down on it. It feels just as robust as like something like an iPad or something. So it's nice that they put a lot of rigidity into the screen. It's not quite as responsive as some reviewers have made it out to be. I don't know why that is, but there's a delay whenever I want to drag a block. If I tap, it seems pretty good. And scrolling also, there's a slight delay as you just saw there. So I'm not certain why there is these delays, but in general, this screen is really good. From the distance you're going to be looking at this, the resolution is clear enough. It's not the clearest. If you look at it closely, it's kind of like the quality of like a Nintendo Switch screen in terms of resolution, but it's definitely much sturdier than a Nintendo Switch screen. So props to Neural. This is a pretty nice screen in my opinion. So the Fractal has a much smaller screen than the Neural. The actual resolution on the screen is not that bad. It's actually quite remarkable. And when you're navigating through, everything's pretty snappy. And it's something that you have to learn over time, however. One of the things that I wish that they had done with this screen is just make a universal up and down, because this knob being as big as it is, I think that rotating would make it go like up and down the list, but it actually goes through your presets instead, which is kind of weird. It's one of those things where having this weird D-pad here plus this like rotary knob kind of makes it hard to read. I think they should just make one that does both. But the screen itself is pretty good. I just don't think that it's something that a lot of people are going to be using very often. It's kind of hard to figure out what screen is in what place in relation to the current screen that you're at, versus I think Neural did a better job with the layout there. Neural basically took that layout from the Helix, and the Helix did a great job with that too. But for the screen durability itself, I think it is actually pretty nice. It is in the same ballpark of sturdiness as the Neural. And I think the resolution on this screen is actually just as high as the Neural's, but since the screen is smaller, it actually looks a lot sharper for some reason. All right, and then the HX Stomp XL screen is super tiny. Honestly though, it's pretty usable. You change the mode of the screen with this button down here. It's nice that the mode button's right here, so you can switch the mode. So if you want snapshots, if you want presets. Quality of the screen itself seems pretty sturdy. It feels more plasticky than the other two. I don't know if it's actually made of plastic or not, but it just doesn't seem quite as sturdy as the other two. Again, this is a much lower price point. So that's kind of to be expected here. So when you're upgrading from this price point to something more expensive, I guess that's just kind of something that you get, is just a better screen. So when it comes to the screen, definitely Neural wins here. It's still not perfect, however. I really want to try a head rush to see if it compares to this. But this one, there's a little bit of lag, but it's not terrible. It's still usable. And I know the new Fender Tone Master Pro also has a touchscreen, but I hear that one's laggier than this. So I guess this is still kind of the king of the crop. I was originally going to do a segment on the jacks on the back of all these units and like the quality of them. But really, all of them are fine. What's nice about the Fractal though is that it has ground lifts for each of these. That, in my opinion, kind of gives it a little bit of an edge, but it's also a bigger unit, so it has the space for it. And my biggest complaint about the HX Stomp in terms of the I/O in the back is that the send is a stereo, so you have to have one send cable that splits into stereo, and that's not a common cable that you find. So you have to have a stereo to mono left and right basically, and then you'll have two effects loops effectively. Kind of messed up my cable routing a little bit as well. So it's the one complaint I have about this, but at this price point, there's not really much to say about these output jacks in terms of build. They all seem to be built fairly well. I haven't had any of them fail on me yet. All right, so power supply of these units. The Fractal uses this kind of standard, I don't know what these are called. I'm just going to call this a computer monitor cable because that's what my computer monitors also use. But it uses the same power cord connector as like a tube amp or something. These are very robust, and I really, really like the fact that they use that on this unit. The on and off switch is also right there with it. And it's basically the same kind of switches you get on like other amplifiers as well. It's nice that they're using that. If you're familiar with amplifiers, this will be just insanely easy to use. The HX Stomp XL actually uses a very specific power supply unit. It comes with this adapter thing. It's really large. I don't quite like that. So if you're putting it on like a power strip or something, like it's just not going to be easy to fit it with a bunch of other things plugged in as well. So I'm not a big fan of that. So the strange thing about the HX Stomp XL is that it doesn't use the same kind of jack here. So one of them is a little bit different than the other. This is the HX Stomp XL one, and this is from the Quad Cortex, and they just aren't the same. HX Stomp XL one is just a different size, like the center is just bigger. I don't know the specifics as to the sizing of these adapters, but that is something to know about the HX Stomp XL. And any of my usual pedal power cables actually don't fit in here either. So something to note about the HX Stomp XL. I actually don't like this kind of power cable for my modeler. I kind of prefer just having be a universal one, just like the Fractal. But that also applies to the Quad Cortex. So the Quad Cortex does come with this like brick right here. Plug actually can fit any sort of plug that you would normally use for, say, any guitar pedals that you have. It would just fit into this. So if you have a power supply that can power this unit, then you can actually just put this on your pedal board and power it the same way. You would need like an adapter for the HX Stomp. However, the cord that comes with the Quad Cortex is so cheap. It's so thin in comparison even to the HX Stomp XL power cable. This is actually a thicker cable on the HX Stomp, and then this one for the Quad Cortex is so thin, I would not want this to get ruined. during like a show or something. And all the people I've seen run quad Cortexes in their live rig have used them in a rack unit, like in a tray in a rack. So these won't get messed up in that scenario. But if you have this on the floor, I would be very, very worried about this. So power in this regard is actually really important in my opinion. If something happens with your power, you just can't use your unit anymore. So Fractal wins it by a mile. Whether it be the FM9 or the FM3, they use the same sort of connector you'd find in a monitor, in a guitar amplifier. That is just universal, and it's just nice that if a cable broke and you needed to find another cable, most places probably would have one. The same can't be said about the Quad Cortex or the HX Stomp. I would think the Quad Cortex also edges out the HX Stomp though. I don't know why the connector is different on the HX Stomp itself. All right, so I forgot to mention this, but the Quad Cortex and the HX Stomp's power supplies do not have a ground. What that means is that you'll have to connect it to something that does have a ground. Which, if you're using it into your interface, it's not going to be a problem because your interface does probably have a ground. Both the HX Stomp XL and the Quad Cortex have a dedicated headphone out. And if you were to just run it straight into a headphone without connecting it to anything that has a ground, you might get a lot of noise. Just something to note. So one last thing about the Quad Cortex I wanted to mention that I really don't like is that the moment you plug it in, it turns on. And there is an on button here, but it is a touch capacitive button. And I don't think there's a setting to enable it to be off by default when plugged in. So if you're like me, where I try to turn off my power strips every night because I just want to conserve power for whatever reason, this will always turn on every time you turn on your power strip. And I don't like that. I wish it was just kind of a physical button. The touch thing is like a big part of their design language, but I honestly think they could have just done an on and off button on the back. The HX Stomp has this little tiny slider button. It's kind of like what you get on like an old Game Boy. HX Stomp and Fractal kind of just win for that. Anyway, that's been kind of an overview of these devices. Let me know if there's anything that surprised you about the build quality of these devices. There are definitely a few things that surprised me that stood out. The volume knob on the Quad Cortex I think is like the worst part of it, and hopefully in future iterations they will improve that. Fractal needs to just completely change how they do their interface here. They need to get with the times. And for what it's worth, the switches on this feeling the best out of the three for being the cheapest priced of the three. I am very impressed by the HX Stomp XL. So yeah, time will tell if any of these are actually a concern in the future. Let me know if you have any of these units and if you've run into any sort of build problems with any of the specific things that we talked about in this video. So yeah, that's going to do it for me. Thank you so much for watching, especially to those who've made it this far. If you like what you saw, please consider hitting like and subscribe, and I'll catch you on the next one. Later.